What's up, everyone? Welcome to my new series where I talk about different aspects of TF2, of competitive TF2. Today's video, I will be talking about a topic that will piss off all the engineer fans out there. Sorry, Uncle Dane, eat your heart out. I don't know why I'm so happy saying that. I shouldn't be. Engineer. Engineer is a class that I feel should always be a little bit underpowered, and I want to explain why and tell you why I think the engineer should be a little bit underpowered all the time. I think Valve, if they're doing their jobs correctly, should always keep the engineer at least slightly underpowered. So imagine a world where we go the other way. Imagine a world where the engineer is slightly overpowered. If the engineer had an advantage over other classes, you would see more engineers, right? And the problem is, you don't want to see more engineers, okay? You do not want to see a game. I don't care if you're playing competitive. I don't care if you're playing casual. You do not want to see a game where the predominant class in TF2 is the engineer. Because if you buff defensive classes like the engineer, like the heavy, like the pyro, if you buff those classes, you will see more of those classes. Now, why is that a problem? What's the problem with seeing too many defensive classes? Well, you start to run into the situation where the game slows down, right? The engineer is a class designed to slow the game down. That's what it's there for. It's not an offensive class. You're not going to be creating space with this engineer, although I suppose you could try running gunslinger. But really what the engineer is there for is defensive abilities. It's there to stop people from pushing forward into your territory. And I'm sure Uncle Dan already knows this, by the way, but if you're designing a game properly, you do not want the defensive classes to be too strong. If the defensive classes are too strong, everyone will just play defensive classes. The game will slow down to a molasses speed, just a complete stop, right? And you just do not want to have that in your game. So naturally, you're always going to have a situation where the opposite is going to be true. The offensive classes are going to be the ones that are slightly more powerful. Now, you might say, okay, well, why don't you keep all the classes exactly even? Isn't that what you're going for? And the truth is, you could try to go for that, but there's always going to be a situation where one is slightly better than the other. You could try as best you can to balance everything perfectly, and you might get very close, but there's probably going to be a slight lead in one way or the other. And if you're going to have these slight inconsistencies, and that's just going to happen because the classes are different, because they play differently, because they have different mechanics, if the classes are slightly different, you're going to want to favor the offensive classes. The offensive classes are the ones that keep the game moving forward. They're the ones that keep the game, the momentum moving, and allow you to capture the next point and the next one and the next one, or just keep the game moving along. That's what you want to see. And so that is why when you watch a game of competitive TF2, you're going to see the strongest classes, the classes that people favor are going to be the scout, the soldier, and the demo man. And why is that the case? Is because the game designers have designed those three classes to be three of the strongest classes in the game. Again, if engineer was the strongest class in the game right now, you would be seeing way more engineers in competitive play. And that's not the case because the engineer is slightly underpowered, as it should be. Now, in my mind, let's just go a little bit further than that. Why is the engineer underpowered today? And this is of New Year's Eve here in 2016. So the reason why I see the engineers being a little bit underpowered right now is because he doesn't have those mobility options that other classes have. Imagine, the engineer's shotgun. The shotgun is basically the same thing as the scattergun that the scout has. So you imagine you look at the scattergun against the stock shotgun for the engineer. They're basically the same thing. So if they're basically the same thing, you're really looking at a guy who walks really slow versus a guy who walks really fast and jumps twice, right? A guy who walks really slow and jumps once versus a guy who walks really fast and jumps twice. Other than that, they're kind of got the same amount of health, although you could run Gunslinger, like I mentioned before. It'll give you a little bit more health there on Engineer, but then you have, bonuses for the Scout that give them double, triple jumping and other abilities to survive longer, right? So I think that kind of balances out for the time being. I don't want to comment too much about the actual balance of those specific weapons, but the general idea of the two classes are One moves really fast, very mobile, can get in there, do the damage, get out. And the other class, the engineer, if you wanted to get in there and do damage, you'd either have to get buffed by your medic and push forward straight directly into the enemy team, or you'd have to hide like a ninja in a corner, wait for them to turn the corner, and then you just, blast them a couple times in the back. I feel like, generally speaking, the engineer is at the disadvantage there when it comes to being offensive. And that's how it should be. And you look at the bonuses that the engineer gets. You're looking at a level 3 sentry or a gunslinger. A level 3 sentry just takes a long time to get set up there, so you got to build that thing up, you got to move it forward, and then if the enemy team is coordinated, they're going to spam that down, they're going to take it down as quickly as they can. If it's a gunslinger, even easier to kill, to be honest. One pipe or a sticky well-placed will be taking that thing down very quickly. So I have mixed feelings about the engineer. On the one hand, I sympathize with the Uncle Danes of the world. I sympathize with the engineer mains of the world who believe that, engineer is a really fun class to play, and that's their favorite class, that's their go-to, that's what they want to see doing well when compared against other classes. But on the other hand, if you're just looking at TF2 on the whole, you really should have a general interest in the balance of all classes, and that is why in TF2 today, you have these sort of core classes, the offensive classes. Those are your strongest classes. Those are the mobile classes. And then that's what keeps the game moving forward, right? And the other classes, the defensive classes, the sort of specialized classes, those classes, the pick classes, I could call them, are sort of relegated to situational uses, situational roles, where you kind of, if you had to choose between an engineer and a scout, you'd probably choose the scout, but maybe the engineer is good in certain situations. And I don't think that classes like the engineer, like the spy, are, like the pyro, the heavy, these are classes that you probably should not be running full time unless the game mode that you're playing forces you to do that. So if you're playing Highlander, for example, and you have to have an engineer, then go for it, run an engineer. If you're playing a Sigafu Cup 7 versus 7 and you're required to run one of each class up to a maximum of 7 players, then yes, you might consider taking an engineer. But generally speaking, if you watch the Sigafu Cup, there weren't a lot of engineers being taken unless you were playing on a payload map. A lot of teams, when you're playing with an extra player or two and you're forced to class limit 1, will choose to play with a sniper or a spy instead, because the one-shot kill capabilities of those classes are stronger. And again, if you're ranking them between mobility classes and then specialized one-shot kill classes like the sniper, spy, or the defensive classes, it should be as strongest to weakest in that order. The mobility classes should be the strongest, then your pick classes should be second strongest, and your defensive classes should be the third strongest, or the weakest, you could call it. Because, again, you want to keep that game moving forward. If the game were to slow down too much, it would just become a boring, stalematey, stare at each other until the timer ticks down to 0 kind of game, and I don't think anyone wants to see that. So there is one more thing that I want to say about this topic. Some people will watch this video and say, okay, I understand that defensive classes by nature must be a little bit slightly underpowered compared to mobility classes, compared to offensive classes that will push the game forward and move that game along. What if you gave something to the engineer, right? If you're the developers of the game, what if you gave something to the engineer that gave it those mobility options, that maybe even gave it the sort of pick class options and sort of allowed the class to maybe break out of this defensive hole that it's in? Because if it stays in this defensive hole, you have to keep it slightly underpowered. But if you can give it mobility options or give it pick class options, it could potentially become a little bit more buffed. And in that scenario, you could consider replacing your scout with an engineer. Like, what would you have to do to an engineer to do that? Well, we've already seen Valve do this in the past with their engineer design. They gave the engineer the gunslinger, which was, we've talked about already a couple times in this conversation, but they gave the engineer the gunslinger as a mobility option, right? So as opposed to putting that level 3 sentry down, just takes a long time, you're just bogged into this defensive situation, you can run around the map with the gunslinger, slap that level 1 mini sentry down, and that thing will just quickly build itself. And that kind of is balanced, right? Where you're saying, okay, now the engineer is not really a defensive class, now he's more of an offensive class trying to take ground away. He moves forward, he puts the mini sentry down, and he's actively trying to move the game forward that way. And when they initially introduced the gunslinger to the game, it was extremely powerful, actually. I think the gunslinger was very, very strong. So strong that the competitive community had a little bit of backlash against it. They banned that from the game. And since then, it's been nerfed a little bit and is a little bit more palatable. But I think that generally speaking, that has been an attempt that Valve has made to sort of move it into that mobility category. You can take a look at the Frontier Justice, which when your gun dies gives you those crit hits for each kill that your gun got. That has the potential to one-shot kill somebody, and that sort of moves the engineer towards the pick class option. So I think that Valve has sort of experimented with giving engineer the option to move into these other ways to play the game. And the reason they do that, and this is, not my decision, I'm just kind of interpreting what Valve has decided, is that they've kind of given an indication that they recognize that people enjoy playing specific classes, that they enjoy playing engineers as an engineer main, that they identify themselves as a specific class player. For example, I identify myself as a medic main. Uncle Dane identifies himself as an engineer main. So I think that Valve has made attempts to make the engineer class viable outside of just the defensive option in order to help it break out of that defensive space that it's in. And I'm personally a little bit worried about that because I fear for the homogenization of the game. TF2 has 9 very distinct, unique classes with their own personalities and their own style, but also with their own class mechanics that give them a unique way to play the game. And I feel that if every class had a shotgun, for example, if every class had a sniper rifle, then it just kind of homogenizes all the classes, doesn't make them as unique anymore. And a lot of people will look at this video, say, well, SLIN, you're a competitive player. Of course, you like the game the way it is, where you have these sort of core classes and then these pick classes and these defensive classes that you situationally rotate into your team composition. But I really do feel that as someone who's really enjoys the game will have a good understanding of how all the classes play, and they'll have a general understanding that, yes, Soldier is generally a pretty well-rounded class that's good in a lot of different situations. Yes, the Scout is a pretty well-rounded class that is good in a lot of situations. Same goes with the Demo Man and the Medic. And I feel like there's these core classes that should always be very strong, and you have these other situational classes that are not as strong. But I do think that Valve is trying to take the game in a different direction, where they're trying to say, hey, look, we realize there's pyro mains out there. We realize there's heavy mains. So we're going to try and rework those classes to make them viable in a lot of situations. Just like how Soldier's viable in a lot of different situations, we're going to take a look at pyro, we're going to take a look at heavy, and try and rework them to give them those options. And I think engineer might be on the list as well later on down the line. I don't think engineer is as broken as pyro or heavy that it needs to get fixed right away. But engineer, the Frontier Justice, it's an interesting mechanic. It's just not that strong right now. And then I think for the Gunslinger, we've already seen what happens when that becomes too strong, because then you have all the benefits of a defensive class plus the offensive capability of continually moving forward. I think that's a very dangerous combination. It's actually a little bit too strong. So again, I personally prefer if classes are in clearly defined boxes, if they're in clearly defined roles, but I can see a world where Valve sort of homogenizes the abilities of each class to give them all a little bit of everything so that they still retain their general class mechanics, but they also have the ability to be used in a variety of different situations. So ultimately, I think that that's where engineers headed. I think that as we see the game progress and as we see the developers put more time into the game and work on the classes, I think that's something that needs to be addressed. If you're going to make all 9 classes viable at all times, then take a look at, are these pick classes, are these mobility classes, or are these defensive classes? Instead of looking at it that way, say, okay, look, every class has mobility options, has pick options, has defensive options, and now you can kind of pick the class that sort of suits you the best. I think that kind of robs the game of its individual classes and all the unique roles that they play, but I'm kind of interested to hear what you guys have to say in the comments below. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think. I know for a lot of engineer mains out there, like I said, they're going to be a little disappointed, but if I was designing the game, that's how I would do it. I wouldn't make the defensive classes the strongest class in the game because I would just bog everything down. But I'd love to know what you guys think, and catch you guys in the next video.